And I think just to get us kicked off, we'll go around and do some introductions before getting into the topic of today's discussion, which is going to be grant allocation strategies and the joys of that. So yeah, I'll pass the mic over to Ben, and then we'll come across this way with intros.
Well, yeah, so hi everyone. I'm Ben Perez. I was about to say where I work, but I'm not working anywhere at the moment, so that's a whole other story we can get into a bit later. But yeah, my background is basically in resource allocation. Actually worked at a place, Pumco worked previously, where I was head of resource allocation and human capital for the organization in Asia. And it was really about optimizing the growth and scale of that business, which was already 30,000 people. So I've always had a real passion around how talent drives organizations, and I think capital efficiency and resource allocation is a huge part of that.
Hi everyone, I'm James. I'm the head of community at Octon. It's a platform that's running grant rounds every 90 days from the yield from large ETH treasury that's been staked. I'm more experienced in the social side and thinking in a lot of ways how we can use our resources towards community growth. At least that's what I'm focused on. More of my experience in community building has been IRL, and so I've just been diving into this sort of thought processes over the last few years, but nevertheless had some really good experiences over the last year or so that I'm really excited to share.
Awesome, thank you. We will also have Mr. Kevin Owocki, so I will just pre-introduce him once we're in the conversation, though I'm sure everyone here knows him. Oh, he left? Oh, awesome. All right, so maybe we won't have Mr. Owocki, but he is going to be doing a whole thing on Thursday at the Regen Hub on a capital allocation book, so yeah, pre-plug for that, I guess. But I'm Eugene Leventhal. I'm currently Executive Director of MetaGov, as mentioned in the previous discussion. And yeah, just very excited to kind of get into thinking about these different allocation mechanisms and kind of what are some of the pros and cons of different ones. And so I think to maybe get us kicked off, it would be interesting hearing from both of you with your own experience of grant programs or any funding allocation environment. What have been the kind of mechanisms that you've seen used in the places you've worked?
Sure. So yeah, we've been running community-based grant rounds, most recently using, unfortunately, a plutocracy that was largely a decision because we weren't confident really yet in the anti-Sybil solutions out there in the market. And if you're not aware, we actually had that blow up in our face within our most recent round. Something that we were already aware could quite possibly happen and ended up happening, so that lit a fire under our team's butt to move towards a more democratic approach for allocating. So we're moving towards quadratic funding for this upcoming round that starts next week. And that obviously has a lot of benefits to where our community isn't going to feel that they're being pushed away unless they have access to large amounts of capital. So from my perspective, it's a really good community building tool, and we've already been seeing some early stage growth around that. Beyond that, yeah, I would say the plutocracy was not so much of a community building tool from the community perspective, but it has been really good in driving relationships with the partner programs and the public goods that we've ultimately been trying to fund. So definitely some good results from that at an early stage.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I was working in a place called Pocket Network, and essentially these grant mechanisms were a way of us bootstrapping, how to implement the organizational strategy through the community. I think that is like a really important thing to have coherence between. A lot of grant allocation strategies that I see today seem to be disconnected from business strategy, and in fairness, because maybe there isn't a business strategy sometimes. I think there's probably more strategy in the grant allocation process sometimes than the organization at large. So I think that's a really important part of it. And then I think it's a system of grant allocation approaches that is needed. Some grant approaches I think are better than others, stronger than others in some areas. And therefore, it's more not one. It's like, what is the system of grant allocation strategies you want to put in place to get to where you need to go? So, yeah, I think Kevin back now, but yeah, that's how I think about it.
Cool. Thank you. And welcome to Mr. Kevin Owocki joining us. You want to give a quick intro?
Hey everyone, sorry I'm late. I'm a bit of a calendar mix-up. My name is Kevin Owocki. I co-founded Gitcoin. Yeah.
Cool. Nice and simple. And the other guys just answered the question of what kind of capital allocation mechanisms have you interacted with at the place you work. So at Gitcoin, I mean, I know James alluded to quadratic funding, but if you want to touch on how that's gone at Gitcoin real quick, or I could just give you a breather if you need a minute, because I feel like you just ran in here.
I did just run here, yeah. I'm happy to take that though. So Gitcoin has been traditionally known for quadratic funding, has delivered over $60 million worth of funding to Ethereum public goods through quadratic funding, and we're now going multi-mechanism. The other mechanism that we've had success with has been retroactive public goods funding in the style of Optimism. So we've worked with the Optimism Foundation on building their voting interface for retroactive funding round 3, and then we launched that as easyretropgf.xyz, which is a tool that allows anyone to do Optimism style retroactive funding for their ecosystem. And we've also been involved in the round 4 voting interface, which is an impact metric based system where you basically vote based off of impact metrics that you want to reward. And we're going to add that to the Easy Retro PGF business line in the future. And yeah, there's a long tail of mechanisms that I dabble with and hope to bring to the Gitcoin product suite at some point in the future. But there's sort of a long tail of frontier mechanisms that I think could become the next QF or retro PGF in the future.
Great, thank you all. And my own experience has very much been around research funding and research grants. So throughout the conversation, I might try to pepper in how in some of these different mechanisms, different use cases, whether certain public good applications or things like research, how that actually fits into and may or may not be well supported in certain structures. But I think to kind of start the discussion, it might be interesting to even zoom out a level. And right, it's already been mentioned multiple times, but grants are one aspect of capital allocation more broadly. And so I'd be interested in hearing how you all think about do you have clear definitions of where grants start and end? And, you know, is like hackathons a pre-grant thing and then you grant and then you do VC, or, you know, like, do you have your own mental models of what is the potential flow of these type of allocation strategies at a high level?
Start back. Go first. Yeah. So I think ultimately resource allocation is about having the right person in the right place at the right time for the right price. And I think that's like just a really simple way of thinking about it, and probably indicates, to me at least, that it really does start with like what you're looking for in terms of the talent you're trying to attract. I think sometimes we can be thinking about how these strategies maybe reward the people that turn up, and I actually think with resource allocation it's usually a combination of allocating capital and allocating human capital. So I think it is really core to like how businesses operate, but I think it's on a level with really understanding like what is the talent strategy, what is the people strategy you're looking to implement, and it's really complementary to that.
Yeah, I think for us, we've definitely seen it as a big investment vehicle for our community. One of the big things that's been longstanding within the Golem ecosystem is that there's been this prevailing narrative that with all the finances in the world, there's still been this lack of investment within community and not doing nearly as much as we could. So we've definitely used this as a mechanism both for driving impact towards Ethereum-based public goods, but also to signal to our community that we care about them as well and allowing them to have impact over the distribution of that. So where do they start and end? Is that the question?
Yeah.
I think for us, because we're a small team, we've tried to kind of sit in the middle of funding projects that already have some sort of reputation, and then I'm not leaning so far to the end where it's a retroactive round. So that's kind of how we've been navigating it thus far, is being confident that that's a project that is far beyond the idea stage, and giving them the continued support that they might need to further on their mission.
Yeah, so where do grants start and end? Well, I think that one of the ways that I like to think about this is through an allegory of like the internet. And I think that the internet fundamentally changed society because computers could now send information across a computer network, and anything that relied on information was revolutionized because of the internet. So entertainment, media, politics, we didn't have social media before the internet. And, I think like a similar thing is happening with finance, where we now have the internet of finance and we can send scarce value across a computer network, and that's going to change everything that relies on finance. And so the like allegory here is like, jobs and investments and capital allocation and grants. And so I think that like if you in the 1990s had asked someone to predict the things that we just take as commonplace today, things like Twitter and TikTok, it would have just like blown their minds to think of how like information messaging has evolved. And you think about the lineage from snail mail to email to IMs to Twitter and then like TikTok, and I kind of think of there's like a similar going to be an evolution of capital allocation where we're going to go from like grant offline grant programs to online grant programs to on-chain grant programs, and then whatever's after that, whatever's even over that horizon, we wouldn't call it grants because it's just like so far over the horizon. So I think that we're in like the first or second inning of capital allocation, and that being rewritten by the on-chain internet, and it's gonna get weird. I'm here for it.
Yeah, when you said what comes after on-chain, that's scary, like DNA encoded with Neuralink or whatever crazy nonsense will be proposed.
That's your idea.
Yeah. Oh no, we're recorded. But yeah, I think it's also interesting that the three of you have kind of both had a specific experience very deeply rooted in initially one type of mechanism and various kind of either changes in what you used in your program, or especially I know you also are releasing a book officially in 2 days, right? Today's Tuesday, on capital allocation mechanisms. So I think it'd be interesting to hear with the mechanisms that you have worked with in your ecosystem, what prompted you to think about a new one? And kind of what was it that was lacking, and just like please define which was the one you were using, what was kind of lacking, and what did you end up switching to or at least considering? So yeah, Ben, would you mind kicking us off?
I can kick that off. Yeah. So when I started Pocket, there was one mechanism. It was retroactive funding, but not in the way that we think about it as optimism style. It was, I've built something, now I go back to the DAO and I beg them to give me some money for it. Yes. And that was a super contentious process, highly inefficient, demoralizing often. It was really bad. So we implemented pretty quickly two mechanisms. The first one was RFPs, really to give people the opportunity spaces to flow into and the certainty that funds would be there for them when they did that, which was sort of like our first proactive funding mechanism. And then we implemented another one, which we called Sockets, but have updated now to Quick Grants, which was essentially like a very small permissionless grant for people to innovate and to try and create evidence, rather than turn up and say, here's my idea. Just give people a small grant to get started and see if they turn over the evidence that it should continue. So I think for me, having that dynamism of different mechanisms is a way to sort of challenge the history and maybe move away from things you've had previously.
Yeah, I like what you said there about challenging that. We were using a plutocratic mechanism. Obviously, that comes with a lot of downsides when you're trying to build community. So this is going to be the first round where we're running QF, but we've been running a couple of community rounds using GrantStack that has been really beneficial for us, and that as well was using QF, and I think that was partially one of the reasons that drove us to switching over our feature rounds in towards that mechanism. We also elected a governance council that was the sole authority over distribution of funds for a community round that we just finished, I think, about 3 weeks ago. And so that was also based upon the fact of wanting to give the community more impact and more say about how funds are being distributed in Octon. And we got a lot of good feedback from the community overall about how that whole process went. So I think diversifying the way that we've been allocating our funds from this initial setup has been really beneficial and what we're going to continue to explore.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for the Gitcoin shell. Gets that out of the way so I don't have to do it. I mean, I think these things are fundamentally tools, right? And you use the right tool for the job. You use grants to get growth. Like if you were building a shed, you wouldn't say like, oh, I noticed you started with a saw, but then like when the job became putting it together, you switched to a hammer. Like, you use the right tool for the job. And I think that like what we're going to see is a toolbox of different tools that people can use for different jobs. Quadratic funding, I think, is great at creating more democratic types of capital allocation in these communities. That's where Gitcoin started, to actually answer your question. And then retroactive funding, I think that Optimism has pioneered, and it's based off of a different trust assumption. It's based off of, oh, you've already done the work, and so it's easy to evaluate whether the work was valuable or not. And like, I think that Gitcoin pivoting to multi-mechanism is a recognition that there's going to be many different tools that can create ecosystem growth, and quadratic funding was just like the first app. And so, we're fundamentally moving in more of a pluralist direction. And I think that the fact that we've made these investments in Allo protocol and making it easier to spin up new capital allocation strategies, that once Allo 2.1 launches at DevCon, it'll be easy to take quadratic funding off the shelf and put it into your DApp and not have to worry about it, or retro funding and put it into your DApp and not have to worry about it. And so I'm just here for the exploration of the design space, and I'm excited for what comes next.
And I think it's interesting that as you've all been talking, it's been kind of alluding to or directly touching on kind of the pros and cons of some of these, right? And we're not doing like an exhaustive mapping of all potential mechanisms today. I think that would take up the entire day itself.
And that's what my book does.
Yes, and come Thursday here. But, we've already heard it say like there's prospective grants, right? You grant someone up front to then go do a thing. Even in that, we've heard the nuance of there's small grants. There's kind of different approaches you could take of what's your priority within that. Do you just want to ship it out the door as soon as possible? Probably if you're doing like $1 million+ checks, you don't want to ship it within a week. You might want to do diligence for a little bit of time. So there's definitely a couple of different levers to pull there. We talked about retro, which is about, hey, you've done a thing, let's reward. And I know, Ben, you mentioned the challenge of sometimes community reception, or the feeling of going through that of like, hey, I did the thing, it might not have matched perfectly, so I don't get anything. And then, who does that promote to keep building and relying on that mechanism? Quadratic, I know you've both mentioned about the element of the community aspect of that. Of it's a very strong signaling mechanism of how the community can pretty much flag like, hey, based on how the mechanism works, I don't need to invest or feel like I'm a funder, right? I can drop $1 here, $1 there, and thanks to matching it, goes much further and signals more. Are there any type of mechanisms, thinking about the moving beyond, or what else you want to see experimentation with? Whether it's within these existing kind of very common mechanisms or new things that, Kevin, I know you talked about like 30 some odd mechanisms in the book. Are there any specific things you want to, let's say, get more data on, and you want to get a better sense of how is this actually going to work when it's put in front of people, when, more than a handful of people play around with this, when we're trying to scale this kind of system, and what are the potential kind of pros or cons of that?
Yeah, one part of the design space I think is really interesting is just looking at like very, very simple mechanisms. And simplicity is elegance, and simplicity is legibility in a lot of ways. And I think that like you re-roll the dice 100 times, like if Gitcoin had started off with like simpler mechanisms and then iterated towards quadratic funding, our tools would look different, versus starting with quadratic funding and being like, wait, this is kind of complicated. We have simple resistance we have to solve, and collusion we have to solve. And like, anyway, so I'm interested in simple mechanisms. One that I've been thinking about a lot recently is this one that Raid Guild's been working on called Cookie Jar. And it's basically just a smart contract that you put tokens in, and then you maintain a hats tree, which is just basically a list of roles. And then anyone who's on that list of roles can withdraw tokens from the cookie jar and like leave a note saying what they've done. And I really believe in bottoms-up empowerment of people, and anytime you have to ask your manager for reimbursal and you have to track receipts for, I don't know, you threw a party at HCC, you bought everyone dinner at HCC, or you had a Versal bill or the AWS bill and you have to like ask for reimbursement, like those trust assumptions create drag on people doing things bottoms up, where reality, I want people to be rewarded for doing things bottoms up. And the cookie jar is just a very elegant mechanism to say, hey, we're within a circle of trust. Why don't you remove some money from this cookie jar and use it for whatever. Like, don't abuse it, but it's just like a very simple and elegant mechanism. And it sounds like we're going to be rolling that out on Allo protocol and within Gitcoin DAO sometime soon. It's not going to like change the world or anything, but it kind of shifts the culture bit by bit to more bottoms up. So anyway, there's 30 something mechanisms in the book, and discovering dozens more as I ship the book, if people tell me, oh, you missed this one and that one. But just this simple design space is what's got my attention a lot right now.
Yeah, I think something that I'm really interested in is this idea of curation, because we've long been seeing or hearing from builders that have been participating in our rounds that they want to focus on building. They don't want to have to continue to market why they are important and why they should receive funding. So what I've been seeing two things that obviously aren't perfect right now, but I'm really excited to begin exploring. One is called Abundance Protocol, where you can actually create a curated registry of your community members that you trust and allow them to go and seek out potential projects that are having impact in your ecosystem. And he's doing this through the Forecastle protocol, and he's designing a lot of the social value that you can get out of a social network like that into the equation. And then another one that I'm really excited about is something that's coming out of D-Org, who built DAO Drops, is called Polywrap, which is using an AI algorithm to create a list based upon whatever theme that you might be interested in funding. So it takes impact metrics and a lot of other data to curate you this list. And granted, it's not perfect right now, but it's maybe another way for people to go and find out in a fairly quick and accessible way like what they would be interested in funding without having to go to Twitter Spaces or read long-winded blogs or forum posts about why they should be potentially funding some of these builders. So yeah, I'm really interested to see how curation might be solved and moving away from this like marketing cycle that everyone seems to be a part of.
They both sound really cool, so I'm looking forward to reading up on those. I think I'm quite aligned with Kevin. I'm really excited about permissionless style grants. My reason for being in this space is that there's a lot of gatekeepers in society today that decide who has access to opportunities, and I think reputation and permissionless systems can be a way for overcoming that. So I think there's different parts of that. Can sort of break it down. One area that I'm interested in is reputational staking, where there's sort of no barrier to starting, but then some staking around your own reputation and how that's impacted by the results that you put on the board. And moving more towards this evidence-based approach. I think evidence over confidence or marketing or whatever people use to sort of get funded today often is going to be a much better and more healthy way for us to go forward.
Yeah, and I think in kind of hearing about these, it's also really bringing up the point that when we're talking about mechanism design, of course, there's the literal funding mechanisms, which is what we were just touching on. That's not the only design space here when it comes to overall designing, your allocation strategy and how you're thinking about it. We're talking about reputation, about like the review structures as well go into it, and especially when thinking about making grant programs more permissionless, I think it'd be interesting to hear from the three of you of what do you see as the potential, let's call it levers of decentralization? What are the things where you can introduce more or less voices depending on how you want it, ranging, I don't want to preempt it by then listing stuff. But would be interested in like which part of the grant program's design, running it, anything afterwards, which parts do you want to see more voices get included? Ben.
Yeah, I'm highly conflicted on this one because I think we built a mechanism that I was really excited about and proud of, and it just didn't work at all. Because the place that we wanted to introduce more community participation was on the accountability of the grantees. Like we wanted to create permissionless grants where anyone could get start, but it only continued if the community said, this is valuable, this is useful, this is driving impact, or whatever the thing was trying to do. So that didn't work at all because people did not want to be involved in that part. They didn't want that responsibility. They didn't really want to share their voice. So I think it's maybe going to be more inclusion in simply how funds are allocated at a higher level up. It's sad that I'm saying that out loud, and I'm looking to be convinced. But even with like the optimism style retroactive public funding, it's a real grind in terms of the decision-making process around that. We come up with a novel mechanism, which I think is maybe better, but I think there's always going to be a real grind around that side, and we probably need to think of the fact that if people don't want to participate in governance a lot today, giving them a lot of decisions to make and hundreds of things to review is probably not going to work.
Yeah, I think we're going to be experimenting more with like a wide range of, or a wider part of the spectrum of both involving the entire community and then also all the way to the other end where we're just curating a very small list of community members that we trust and then experimenting with a lot of different things in between, because we don't have the data yet, I think, on what's really going to work. But I think continuing to experiment with different ideas and try to iterate based upon the data and the feedback we're getting is going to be the only way that we eventually get there to building more confidence in that.
Yeah, I mean, I think attention is the pivot point, and just to build on top of Ben's point about that, I think what Optimism did in round 4 for on-chain builders is really interesting, not only for scaling the badge holders' output per unit of attention, but also making it a more impact metric-centric round. So basically, for those of you who haven't seen the interface for Optimism round 4, basically if you're a badge holder in round 3, you would add projects to cart, and then you would check out those projects and allocate capital to them. But what they did in round 4 was you actually had to take impact metrics, like add them to cart, and then the system translates those impact metrics into a distribution of votes. So if I was a badge holder who was voting, I'll add total block space consumed to my cart, and then unique addresses that consumed it to cart. I'll allocate 50% to the first metric and 50% to the last metric. So I got 2 things in my cart, and it represents hundreds of projects, and the system does the work of allocating the metric into the projects. And so that's, I think, an example of basically respecting the badge holders are badge holders because they're not because they are experts in every single of the 700 projects that are in the round, but because they have high level context of what they want to incentivize and fund. And then the game in round 5 and 6 and everything is going to be taking the most important metrics and quantifying them and putting them into the interface. And there's a danger in this, by the way. It's called Goodhart's law, which is like when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So like as soon as you fund people based off of block space consumed, and then you're basically going to get people who are gaming that metric. So like there'll be dragons there down the line. But in the meantime, I think it's a cool experiment in scaling attention, and it's going to be available on Easy Retro PGF in the next couple months. So if you want to do it in your ecosystem, hit me up.
Great, thank you. So we're getting to the final portion of our panel. We have a little less than 10 minutes left, so I wanted to open it to the audience for questions. So does anyone have questions either for anyone here specific about their own experience with the grant programs or just more broadly in the context of capital allocation and granting?
No. Kidding off you.
Oh, don't worry, I got more for you guys to say then. So
No.
it's just always good to share the love. Yeah, so please.
How much should grant operators care about specific topics? Right?
How much should grant operators?
Yeah, like if they care about what is important, if they have an idea of what's important for the ecosystem or for the overall, like of course there's a big vision for every grant program, right? There are goals for the entire grant program, but if a grant operator as a human has certain topics that they care more about, that gives them more context, that gives them more insight, more perspective, but it also gives them a bias. How do you think about that?
I can jump into that one first, because we just ran a a retro PGF round using easy retro PGF. And I think what I learned from that is it was a huge task, and having one grant operator would have been a bad way to do it. We had people that had deep care around different parts of the process and actually covered for the weaknesses of others through their strengths. So someone, I'm not sure if you see it currently feeds, had a real strength around the categorization, around the rubric, around that level of detail and specificity that I definitely don't have. So yeah, I think actually running grants programs and having those be a collaborative process is a really critical part of it, which I know is maybe not exactly what your question was asking, but I do think is really relevant to.
To almost died.
Yeah, I mean, I'll also just quickly add that I think depending on what you're trying to accomplish, that may or may not be, right, that could be a bug or that could be a feature. If you want to have a hyper-targeted program and you're doing like a domain allocator model and like having one person who's biased towards the thing that they are tasked to grant towards, could be a positive in a certain sense. But yeah, if you're designing like massive programs that are meant to hit a wide swath, definitely being aware of that feels tremendously important. Ben, what did you?
I'm curious how you're thinking currently about the integration of all of these tools and mechanisms, because as like a grantee, it's amazing the pluralism of all these different mechanisms and rounds that are happening, all the tools, whether it's ArmorGap, HyperCert, Gitcoin, retro funding. But as a grantee, it probably feel quite overwhelming applying to so many different things, having to enter in the information, so many different rounds, having to get all of those details. And so, yeah, I'm curious how any of you are thinking about how these tools can be better plugged together and improve the grantee experience, and yeah, how that can translate to round operators as well, and try to create more integrated advanced system.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Gitcoin's in the business of helping people allocate grants, and this is something that we've thought a lot about as more grants programs have launched. We're building this thing called Allo Protocol, which is short for Capital Allocation Protocol, and we've got a registry is one component, and then capital allocation strategies. And as part of it, it's a modular protocol. And one of the things that we're sort of like actively trying to figure out is basically how could we, so like first off, the best outcome would be there was one grant registry to rule them all. But you know that XKCD comic about having one standard, like you just invent one more. And so like the next best thing I think that we could do is like create a common app where you maintain your grant in on Allo Protocol, and then you can publish it out to other registries, and then subscribe to other registries and have those come back to your Allo grant. And that would be like one way to make the grantee experience better, where you just maintain a source of truth all in one place. And that's an investment that we're going to be making. But I think that pluralism is a feature in that it creates anti-fragility and it makes us less dependent on any one ecosystem, but it's also a pain in the ass to have multiple different tools and to manage multiple different things. And, this gets back to like modular blockchains and modular software versus like monolithic, proprietary software. And I think that Ethereum's squarely in the modular camp and the pluralism camp. And so the best that we can do is just build tools to make the UX better across those things. I don't know if you guys have anything to add, but
Sure, go ahead. Yeah, I fully agree with that. I think there's a mental model that I have for it, which is like a talent marketplace. Yep. And I think applying the right mental model, whether it's that or something else, which is user focus, is going to be the way to do it. I think as much as we all love grants and allocation strategies and that sort of thing, putting them at the center or designing for those is maybe not always the right approach. As Kevin said, they're tools to actually achieve something. I think it's to help talent find the opportunities to sustain them, excite them, and to drive forward the things that we want to see driven forward.
Yeah, and I'll say as well, like we're definitely looking to use what appear to be like the prevailing tools that are going to last. And so we're building on top of Allo Protocol, and we're going to be using that registry. We're hoping that other grant operators are as well, so that there's like a similar sort of flow that when you apply for a round or a grant through us, if you go to Gitcoin as well, all that information is going to be populated and ready to go. So we're hoping that kind of takes off.
Yeah, and just to add a few things to that, I mean, I know there's various other initiatives, like one at MetaGov is we're working on a grant metadata standard, which we're discussing with Gitcoin and Optimism and a few other teams to help just maximize some of the potential for interoperability as well, right? That's not necessarily, and there is always the trap of standards that Kevin mentioned, but nonetheless, we are early enough and at this point where it actually is going to be more feasible now than it will be 10 years from now. So we'll try fighting the fight. We'll see if it goes anywhere or not. Another thing is the Cartography Syndicate, which is a group of, I think, about 40 of us now, led by Sav from Gitcoin and a few others, we are actually pulling together Karma Gap, and a lot of other relevant players who are building and developing a grant registry that will hopefully capture the vast majority, if not all of the grant programs in the space. And thanks to a grant from Thank Arb, there's the attempt to actually create incentives for operators, for grantees, for various players in the space to keep updating this registry and to make it not just a one-time shot that then becomes outdated the second after we, hit publish, but it's something that actually will continue to be used and updated. And to build off of the Common App idea that Kevin mentioned, I think that having these kinds of open source repositories and more on-chain data will enable kind of different opportunities that, maybe someone will fork what they're building from the Common App and use the same rough base. And, I think a beautiful end state would be where there's kind of a open source Common App that can integrate to any of the application specific Common Apps. That way, as a grantee, your reputation can be tracked across all grant programs. That way you fill out one core piece of information, right? Name, contact info, what's your project information, the broad strokes of your grant. That should roughly be standardized. But then the specifics of, how does it apply to Optimism or Cello or Arbitrum or whatever, those will obviously need to be more specific to wherever you're applying. So yeah, I think there are a couple of interesting efforts. And for those who are already thinking about DevCon and all of the more fun conferencing later this year, we're going to be partnering with Funding the Commons and doing a co-design session as part of the hackathon that's happening there, where we both want to throw out to grantees challenges like, what have been your biggest pain points, and build the stuff that you want grant operators to use. And we'll bring together grant operators to co-design on certain aspects of this as well. So I do think there's a lot of amazing people in the space doing cool things. And I think I just got the we're about to end. So unfortunately, we can't take any more questions, but we'll be here and about the space today and throughout the rest of the week. So yeah, please find time to talk to us. And yeah, just let's give a round of applause to the speakers. And with that, we will pass it off to Ponkar and to the next panel.
Thank you. Thank you. That was great. Yes.
So thank you to panelists. And then we have our next speaker, Beth. Are you ready?